Hello and welcome to this Hot Topics in Governance webinar session that we're running this morning as part of our first ever conference here at Governors for Schools. Today we're joined by Steve Barker and Linda Waghorn of Better Governor. My name is Oliver Keane and I'm Governor Insight Manager here at Governors for Schools. For those who are visually impaired, all speakers in our sessions have been asked to share a brief audio description of ourselves. And I'm introducing this session today. I'm male, white British, mid-30s with light brown short hair. I've got a few housekeeping notes just to go through before we get started. Closed captions are available today, so you can switch these on by going to the bottom right hand side of your Zoom webinar panel. As I said, speakers have been invited to share a short verbal description of themselves. We've disabled the chat function today just so you can concentrate on the slides, but you can ask any questions you have to Steve and Linda by using the Q&A option on the bottom of your screen. The session is being recorded and links to the video will be sent out following the session alongside the slides and the contact details of our guest speakers. Please continue to follow the conference this week and like and share the content you see on social media using the GFS Conference 21 hashtag. And there is a short survey following the session that we would be really grateful if you could complete for us. So just by way of quick introductions for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, Steve is the Head of Governance Services at Better Governor and Linda Waghorn is Governance Associate at Better Governor. And Steve and Linda have worked together for over 9 years. Steve and Linda present a monthly webinar on behalf of Governors for Schools with the aim of supporting governors and those connected with governance to keep up to date with important developments and changes in the sector. The next of these is due to be held on October the 7th, and in that session we'll be looking at the recent update to keeping children safe in education safeguarding guidance, and you can sign up to that session through our website. So without any more delay, I'll hand over to Steve and Linda.
Lovely, thank you, Ollie. Good morning, everybody. As Ollie said, my name is Steve Barker, and you've heard a little bit about my work background, so I won't say any more about that. As far as what I look like, I'm white British. I'm at the very top end of middle age, and I'm being very generous to myself in saying that. And as my children keep reminding me, what little hair I've got is probably pure white these days, but that makes me very self-conscious describing myself in that manner, but hey, there we go. But a very warm welcome to this webinar this morning. Thank you for joining us, and I realise for some of you this is something of an ungodly hour, but we do appreciate your being here as part of the Governors for Schools conference this week. And Linda and I are both delighted to share in the conference and run through this session with you this morning. So just before we go any further,
Steve, you've managed to mute yourself, I'm afraid.
Sorry, this is man and machine not in perfect harmony. I do apologise. I'll keep my fingers away from the buttons. I was just going to say, I'll pass over to you, Linda, to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Steve. I'm a white British woman in my 60s, and again, very pleased to work alongside Steve and continue to work with Governors for Schools in this way. We've got a programme of topics to introduce to you this morning that are all relevant at this time of the year and are particularly relevant as we come out of a pandemic in terms of all children now expected to be at school. So we're going to give you a little flavour of the programme this morning. We're going to talk about what those protective measures might look like in schools, not because we expect you to be operational in designing or in checking those off one by one, but this is about a compliance activity. This is about ensuring that your school have done those things that DfE guidance suggests that they should have done and have got those fully in place. Not unlinked to that, and of course with governance everything has a link to pupils. Everything comes back to children being safe in their environment and in their learning and progressing and learning well. So as a result of that, there's some new information about how recovery is being supported financially. I'll talk a little bit about that. Steve's going to introduce the topic of the new Keeping Children Safe in Education documentation, although there'll be a lot more detail about that in our webinar at the beginning of October, because it is quite a lengthy document, and of course vitally important that we understand what that says in order to hold our schools to account for meeting those new expectations. Steve's also going to cover some information about Ofsted and their plans for their inspection this term, which started last week, and you may have seen Amanda Spillman talking on various media and television news programmes. A little bit about the new schools admission codes, because of course many of us will be in schools where they publish our own admissions criteria, and a little bit about the expectations around the newly introduced early years framework, which was recently updated. So those are the topics that we're going to cover today. Whilst I'm introducing the first few, Steve is going to be manning the Q&A section, so he will put any questions to me and possibly may group some of those together, and again I'll do likewise whilst he's presenting the second part of today. So if we go straight into our COVID guidance, and this as throughout the whole of the pandemic, when schools were open in various ways, closed in various ways, and guidance changed around what schools should be doing as a consequence, even in preparation for the autumn term, there were 5 updates to this guidance since the 6th of July. They weren't enormous in terms of we expect a whole raft of new expectations for schools, but they were refined in terms of what we expect schools to be looking at and to be putting in place, because there was something which they called stepping down, so more flexibility about what children were expected in terms of their environment, and staff are expected to do as a consequence. But it's encapsulated in this statement in the guidance, which is around moving away from those very stringent restrictions that were in place in schools, the bubbles, the very strict rules about people coming and going and being in certain places at certain times in certain ways, and more of a return to the way everybody's life works day to day, and moving the risk, it might be said, more to what's best for you in your school. So you take those decisions based on the risks of your building, your environment, your population in school, your context, alongside some very clearly laid out for your school or your academy what that looks like for you, and those targeted things that are in place at the beginning of school. So in many schools they have reduced the need for staggered start and finish times, but for other schools they found that worked well for them for other reasons, so they've retained that. This is against that pragmatic approach. The government is saying the risk is now for you to determine, but we want children to be back in front of their teachers and to have a broader experience at school, more like that which was in place before the pandemic began. So there's still an expectation that there's some control, infection control in place, but it's very much less than it was before. So let's
Linda, sorry to interrupt. Just before we carry on, we have a couple of people putting questions on the panel at the moment, asking if it's possible to download the slides. I'm afraid we're new to Zoom at the moment, so I'm not quite sure what the possibilities are there. Ollie, are you still online at the moment? Are you able to say whether, certainly we can actually make the copy of the slides available after the event and actually get them sent out, but I don't know whether it's possible to download during the webinar.
Yeah, I'll work on that now.
Lovely, thank you. Sorry, Linda.
So following on from that approach, which is that more flexibility, excuse me, we're looking at this overriding statement for children to have face-to-face education, and that's a broader range of face-to-face education. So for many schools, they've held their first assemblies, they've reintroduced a lot of the more social clubs, and they have started to plan and think about how they're going to have residential and visits for children to those things that enrich the curriculum in their schools before the pandemic, or is maybe a continuation of their improvement plans for a wider range of curriculum activities to be on offer. But there are 4 key elements that underpin the infection control element, recognising that we do not know through the autumn term what infection rates will look like in a variety of different areas and different contexts, nor the impact of pupils going back to school fully, although we are all very hopeful and hope particularly for our own schools and our own areas that we have put the right things in place. So there are 4 elements that now form that infection control. So there are the isolation of those pupils and track and trace. And this is still going to be the way in which we manage people who have symptoms. This will move away from the school's very detailed approach to this. They were very involved in this in the past, so there's still going to be isolation, track and trace. There is guidance on how to manage those pupils and staff who have had close contact with somebody who has an active infection. There is planning in school on how to step up if there are active infections in schools, and there are in the guidance there are suggestions about when that stepping up might take place. And then there are some the other element of that, and there are a few schools that have boarding pupils, and then there was guidance there about children returning or coming to school for the first time from overseas as a boarding pupil. So that won't apply to many of you, but it may definitely apply to some of you in the context in which you govern.
Linda, we've got one general question which is probably worth answering now just before we press on, if we may. George is actually asking about the differences in responsibilities from those people who are trustees at Academy Trust level compared to those of us who are governors in maintained schools, but also perhaps local governance committees, local governance boards. And I think the comment I would make there, George, is that yes, the responsibilities technically are slightly different. In reality, this is all about accountability. The trust board in a multi-academy trust is ultimately legally responsible for health and safety in all of its schools, in the same way as the local authority is for maintained schools. But any of us involved in governance at local level, that responsibility is absolutely delegated to school level, and therefore there is a responsibility. And of course, we can compromise the, shall we say, the good name of the trust or the good name of the local authority by not fulfilling our responsibilities there. So I think the reality is, although technically the legal responsibility may be slightly different in terms of where the ultimate buck stops, shall we say, from a day-to-day responsibility as far as health and safety is concerned, the role of governors is the same in any school. We are responsible for that location. We may have that responsibility delegated to us from above, either from the local authority or from a multi-academy trust, but the responsibilities rest on the ground in the individual school.
So I would say, I would interpret that into detailed conversations at local level, local board meetings. We had this conversation against these slides. I chaired a meeting last night. We did exactly that at our local board level of a small multi-academy trust. The trust will hold individual schools to account. They see the copies of our minutes. They have their trustees meetings. They will have that oversight to ensure that each of those schools will have undertaken that exercise in a broadly similar way and address any issues that they may find as a consequence of having that oversight. Okay, so we look at each of those 4 elements in a little bit more detail. The very hands-on contact tracing that head teachers and their senior teams had to put in place when there was an active infection in their school, that ended on the 18th of July, about the same time that we were all preparing to finish that week for the end of the summer term. The responsibilities now have moved across to the NHS and the local teams, and they will now do that the test and trace activities with any active infections that have anybody that's tested positive, and they will do those phone calls. They will liaise with pupils, parents, staff, and establish and identify those close contacts and take up with them what they need to happen as a result. The big change is that those individuals who have had close contact no longer need to stay away from school. So self-isolation is not part of this new flexibility this term. So it's not necessary for any family member or close contact if they meet the following qualifications, if you like. They have been fully vaccinated, that's both vaccinations. They are aged under 18 years and 6 months, and that is the time frame that roughly corresponds to the 2 vaccinations that 18 plus were able to have up to this point. And remember, we have just started a new regime nationally that includes the younger age group, and there will likely be a change to this guidance as that programme is introduced. So this is up till the end of last week. This is the current situation as applies to all schools at the moment. If a pupil or a member of staff is participating in a vaccine trial, and there are a number of those taking place across the country, and of course those who are unable to be vaccinated because of a medical reason. So for all of those individuals fit into that category where they are expected to be in school, either working or as a pupil, if they meet those expectations. So for the majority of pupils and staff, there is an expectation that face-to-face lessons in a classroom that looks broadly similar to before the pandemic should be taking place in the majority of schools. So if we think about that close contact guidance, that says that any of those staff and pupils, as I say, who've had that close contact but meet those expectations are expected to attend school. There is no need for masks, but they are still an expectation, as is in the rest of wider society, on public and dedicated transport. And my understanding, some of the schools that I've had associations with, is that for secondary pupils, this is still strongly being reinforced by schools and reinforced by the the bus companies that are being employed to provide school transport. There is, if schools are accepting visitors, there may be a visitors policy for masks, and this is where those risk assessments at local level may have a more flexible or a more stringent following of guidance that they have undertaken in their own settings to ensure that they are managing this in consultation with parents, staff and pupils and the situation in that local area. And if therefore, because the information now, the contact tracing has passed to the NHS, if there is an outbreak that meets certain levels contained within the guidance, then the schools will actively work with those local health protection teams and the measures that need the stepping up, if you like, what we need to do as a result of that, depending on the level of infection and the pace of change. This will be more stringent guidance will be enacted as part of that wider expectation, both locally with those health teams and in accordance with the school's own risk assessment. And that brings us into what does the school need to have in place if they are to step up the management of any outbreaks in their own school. So again, there is a framework. We were using contingency plans before the latest flexibilities. They're sometimes called or known as outbreak management plans. And so that terminology is interchangeable. And in fact, in your own situation, you might recognise them with a different name. It doesn't matter what they are called, but they do need to have them in place. So this is a compliance activity as a board. Do you have an outbreak management plan? It is most often on the school's website, so it's available and visible to all. And the guidance was updated on what this outbreak management plan says in August, in line with this greater flexibility. And this is where your school will outline to all, to governors, to staff, to parents, what they would be doing in addition to the measures they have in place at the moment if there were to be an outbreak of coronavirus in the school. And this will include the need for remote education. Because of course, if you've got pupils who are actively off school because they are not very well, then or you have an outbreak which means that some pupils are going to be asked to stay at home in order to control the spread of that infection, then your remote learning programme should have been updated accordingly. And the guidance is saying this should be in place right the way through the year. There should be an understanding at this point in time that there is a remote learning offer updated and ready to go and ready to be put into action, and we should keep on top of that as a programme of activity across the whole of 21-22 should it be needed. So there are some questions that as a consequence governors should be asking. This is not about poring over the detail of either the risk assessment or the outbreak management plan. This is about ensuring through the questions that we ask, the conversations that we have, the documents that we may have been provided with or had a link to, that we can see that the risk assessment has been updated in accordance with this latest guidance, that the procedures have been reviewed, and often that will be very clear from the head teacher's report, or it'll be clear from links to the school website to show us that these things have been put in place. We should ensure that parents and carers have been notified of the changes that have been made. And indeed, we are now into that second week, into that third week for some of school being fully in place. And I know from the report that our head teacher gave last night, there's been tweaks to certain comings in and goings out for different year groups as a consequence of how they reviewed that and put it in place to make sure it is even more effective than they had hoped. Because of course, until you actually activate something, you don't know the impact. And so those little tweaks from parent feedback will enable you to say, yes, it is not only reviewed and updated, but it is being managed effectively to be responsive to and take into account the views of all the stakeholders. Ensuring that that outbreak management plan is in place, and check that that remote learning offer is ready to be enacted. And if there are any children off school at the moment, and that again possibly reported in the head teacher's report, to check that that is actually being delivered, if those children are well enough to receive it, in a way that is responsive to those children's needs, because not all children are equal in their learning or in their ability to pick up on that remote learning offer. Have we got any questions there, Steve?
No, I think we're okay at the moment, Linda. I think the only comment I would make there, and again, both Linda and I were in separate governing body meetings last night, and it was a popular evening for first meetings of the year. One of the questions that was asked at my governing body related to this question about remote learning, and also the idea that where there are new staff, perhaps newly qualified or early careers framework teachers, as we're supposed to call them now, are they aware of the systems that schools got in place? Have they received appropriate training? Because as Linda says, many schools, if not most, or even all schools, will find themselves in a situation where they've got children who are isolating, perhaps pending PCR tests at the moment, and therefore remote learning does need to be activated at very short notice. So it's a good idea for governors to ask the question again. All we want to know is, are plans ready? We don't need to know what those plans are, what the details are, but is the school ready to turn on remote learning should it be needed?
So I think behind the backdrop of this, we've talked very much still about infection control, the impact of the pandemic, and there is this very careful balance that governors need to put in place, that balance between compliance, which is a very large part of a board's role, and the need for holding the school to account for its vision and the outcomes for pupils. Now, they're not unconnected clearly at the moment, because the impact the pandemic has had on a great number of children is very clear, both nationally and in our governance at our local meetings. But we do need to remind ourselves at this time of year, particularly as it is the start of a new academic year, that our school is actively taking part in the assessment of pupils, is understanding where they are in their learning, how that data is being collected and used by teaching staff, because primarily that's its role, to help teachers teach children effectively, depending on where they are. But we also use that at management level, both in senior management teams operationally, but at governance level for our oversight of what is happening for children in their learning. So what we would normally expect, given where we are at the moment, is that there was some kind of assessment done in the spring when children returned to school en masse, that some support and interventions were put in place for some of those children as a result of the extra funding and as a result of the deployment of those staff that support teaching in the classroom. That might be of a whole variety, from teaching assistants to other kinds of support staff that works with specific children in specific ways. But then there will have been a set of data collected at the end of the summer term, and we should be seeing that data. We should be seeing the analysis of that data so that we understand, one, how children were doing in their learning, and two, we can begin to see the impact of some of that support and intervention that was put in place. So we should be seeing data. It is very important that we are able to articulate the narrative of our own school during the pandemic to anyone who should ask us, whether it be other governors, whether it be parents, whether it be Ofsted inspection. I know many of us will be in that framework. But data should be flowing to governing boards. I think that's the first point I would want to make. Your work programme planners, the agendas for your meeting, should reflect what you've done with that data, how you are holding the school to account for helping children to recover any gaps in their learning as a result of your oversight. You need to know what those gaps are, and there is some sort of national research that shows generally children are about 3 months behind, but those from disadvantaged groups tend to be up to 8 months behind. So we should know whether we are, as a school or academy, we are similar or different to that, and what our school is doing about it, and if there is some early impact showing that is actually helpful. We should also know how the money that has been put into our school is being used to help children catch up in their learning or recover from some of the impact of that pandemic. And it won't all be learning, some of it will be around well-being, some of it may even be targeted around some particular safeguarding issues. But we should understand that narrative, that story of what has been the impact on our school and our pupils. What are we doing about it? Is it beginning to work? And do we have a credible plan going into the autumn term and beyond that shows us that the school has a focus for both recovery and for delivering the vision that we set out? In my own school, we had quite a detailed conversation last night about that. We have a very credible and appropriate plan for the autumn term, and that is entirely understandable that head teachers are in that position where let's get the autumn well planned and set out. We need to know as governors how that fits into that overall year 21-22 and how we might monitor what is happening in that school improvement plan. That is our role, to oversee that, hold the school to account and receive data and evaluate progress. And then that leads us very nicely into the next tranche of recovery premium. This now is, rather than being called catch-up, it is being targeted, linked to pupil premium. So pupil premium is that piece of money that is provided to our schools based mainly on those pupils who are in receipt of free school meals. And that is a crude measure to establish the number of pupils that may be in a disadvantaged background in our school. And it is available in all state-funded schools, so local authority supported schools and academies, for all pupils between the ages of 4 and 15. So it does exclude nursery at this stage, but we're talking about right the way through to the end of that age 15 year group. It is £145 for those pupils in primary, and £290 for those pupils where they have additional in secondary, and includes those children in special units. There is a minimum amount that will be payable to each school, irrespective of how many pupils you might have. So each primary school can expect £2,000, and each secondary school can expect a minimum of £6,000. And in reality, what we will be doing as governors will be making sure we understand the impact of the pandemic on those pupils from our disadvantaged group, which we monitor as a matter of our normal meetings anyway. But we will need to understand what the plans are, what the strategy is for supporting those pupils to catch up, particularly as they are that group of children who are more likely, not guaranteed to, but more likely to be more behind than some of our other children.
Linda, sorry, just to jump in there, just to clarify, the £145 rate is actually for all mainstream pupils, primary and secondary. The wording is slightly strange in the government guidance document. It doesn't talk about special schools as such. It talks about special units. That obviously includes those pupils in special schools. We're hoping, well, I am personally, because one of the schools where I'm chair does have a special needs support unit attached to it, that the double rate of the 290 is the rate for those youngsters who have special educational needs and disability, whether they're in special school or in a specialist unit within a mainstream school setting.
And that would apply for secondary pupils if there is a special unit in their school. Indeed. As well, isn't it? Yes. So I'm going to hand over to Steve now, and he's going to pick up on the remainder of the programme for this morning.
Lovely, thanks, Linda. And as Ollie said in the introduction, folks, this is just a little bit of a snapshot today, because we are going to be delivering a webinar early part of next month, so just a couple of weeks away, which is taking a far more in-depth look at this. But of course, keeping children safe is the mainstay of safeguarding, welfare, etc. in our schools and across the whole education system. We've had one republication this year already. That was actually brought out in January, primarily just reflecting the fact that as Britain finally withdrew from the European Union, some of the rules in terms of right to work, etc., which is an element in the safer recruitment side, those had to change by necessity. But we do have a new, there we go, it's coming up, a new version which has actually been published for this month. It was brought out just before the summer holidays started, to give schools the opportunity to have a look at it. It is a very different look to keeping children safe in terms of the content. It's a much larger document, and there's been some fairly sweeping changes of it. So all we're going to do today is just talk about the headlines, if you like, the most significant changes. There is, I should say, a very helpful Annex G, as it's referred to, in the back of the document. And that's what the department described as a table of substantive changes. It actually does detail quite a lot of minor changes in terms of reordering of paragraphs and bringing some extra clarity to some of the content, etc. There are 5 pages of changes altogether, so it is quite comprehensive, as you can see. But what we've done for you this morning is pulled out what we believe the key headlines are. There are far more changes, and as I say, we will talk about those in the webinar that we'll do to follow up. But as far as a hot topics look is concerned, the things that we believe all governors, all trustees, all clerks, anybody involved in governance needs to be aware of going into their first meetings of this new academic year, that's what we've represented on this slide here. And I think the first, and for me probably the most significant change, is that we've seen a gradual creeping in of references to mental health, etc., coming into keeping children safe for the last 3-4 editions now. But what we've seen this time for the first time is a redefining of what the Department for Education sees as the role of staff in schools. Now, don't forget, staff is paid and unpaid staff. And what that now includes is a description that says it's about promoting children's welfare as well as all of the other safeguarding elements. Now, of course, what that is, in broad sweep terms, is very much a reference to the continuing concerns about child and adolescent mental health. It's also a reference to the peer-on-peer sexual abuse and sexual violence. And clearly there are some references there as well to the new statutory requirements relating to RSHE, or the relationship and health education elements of the curriculum. And you will see that theme about children's welfare, and again, don't forget, when we talk about children in safeguarding terms, we mean every young person up to the age of 18. That's how it's defined in legislation. But of course, we're referencing young people as well as what we would traditionally refer to as children. But the elements of mental health, particularly peer-on-peer sexual abuse and RSHE, those are reflected right the way across all sections of this new publication of Keeping Children Safe. And peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence, there is a webinar that we did for Governors for Schools last term, and that contains a lot of information for governors. So the recording of that is still available on the Governors for Schools website. I would absolutely point you in terms of that, because that should be on the agenda for us for this term as governors. We need to know how our school is responding, irrespective of whether we're in secondary or primary. Linked to the curriculum, of course, is online safety. That has been an omnipresent concern now, before the pandemic started, but certainly with the various lockdowns and partial school closures, a lot of concerns have been raised about how safe we know our children and young people are when they're active online. And of course, activity online has increased dramatically as a consequence of COVID, and that's something that we do need to be concerned in. One of the new changes in Keeping Children Safe is that now, as part of the range of topics that must be included in induction for all staff, is online safety. So something to think about as governors. Is our knowledge of online safety and what the expectations on schools are as up to date as it could be? But that's something to reflect on. We then have a new Annex A as part of Keeping Children Safe for this September. And what that is, the department are describing it as a condensed version of Part 1. Hopefully most, if not all of you, will be aware that Part 1 of Keeping Children Safe is the first chapter, which basically is the summary that all staff, paid and unpaid staff in schools, are expected to receive, read and understand, and it is the responsibility of the governing board to ensure that that happens in schools. That's one of the statutory responsibilities. What the government have decided is that perhaps for those staff who are not working directly with children, in other words, those people who are not in the classroom day in and day out, there is an abbreviated version, or a condensed version as they're calling it now, which is available. It's 5 sides as opposed to about 19 pages. And that can be used. Government are very careful on the wording here. They're saying it's available. Schools don't have to use that. They can insist that everybody still receives Part 1 and makes that declaration that they've read and understood it in the same way they have. This is just an option. And similarly, what was Annex A in the last update of Keeping Children Safe has now moved into second place in the list of annexes. It's Annex B now. And this is additional information. So what this does is give all staff, and for that matter, us as governors as well, a very detailed look at some of the key elements of abuse and neglect, some of the things like female genital mutilation, forced marriage, domestic abuse, all of those other ways in which children's safety and well-being can be compromised. You've got more detail there, and there is an expectation now with this new version of Keeping Children Safe that those staff who are working with children, in other words, those who are classroom-based, should actually read Annex B as well as Part 1 of Keeping Children Safe. So those are the key headlines, and say please do join us next month for the webinar where we'll explore those in more detail. But certainly at this stage, we like to suggest, without being patronising where we can, that there are some questions that governors may care to reflect on, asking governing board meetings, etc. this term. And I think one of the most important ones, of course, does relate to staff training. Have staff, all staff in schools, receive training on the new updated version of Keeping Children Safe. It's a very different version from last year, as we've said. And when we think about those staff who are new to the school, has induction for them actually been updated? In other words, does it now include everything it should, including online safety? And just as a thought, this is far more of a reflective question for us all, really. When was the last time as governors we updated our own safeguarding knowledge? That is an expectation. Certainly it's echoed throughout Keeping Children Safe, and I think it's something that all of us in all of our boards should be thinking about. Linda and I spend quite a lot of our working life actually delivering training to governors, and I would say, which it's not a criticism, it's actually a praise, I'm very pleased to say this, probably between 40 and 50% of all of the training we do is about safeguarding. That's about right, I would suggest, but still, I don't believe not enough governing bodies focus on their own training needs as far as this is concerned.
There's a question here from Paul, and it does reflect what we're asked fairly often, Steve. And what he's saying is, I was led to believe that governors are required to read all of Keeping Children Safe in Education rather than the annex. Is this correct?
Interestingly, exactly the same question came up in the session I participated in as part of the Governors of Schools conference yesterday afternoon. As you probably gathered from Linda's reaction, no, it's not mandatory. It never has been mandatory, but, and it's a huge but, it is good practice, of course. Safeguarding is absolutely the responsibility of the governing board to ensure it's in place, to ensure it's fit for purpose, and to ensure it's effective. And therefore, as governors, I'd turn it around the other way and say, well, why wouldn't we? If this is a really key, important part, in the same way that Linda talked about the importance of assessment for governors, schools are all about children's learning, but children's learning in a safe environment, and we need those children to be safe and their well-being being guarded as well, of course. So for me, it is good practice. I would expect governors to engage in training. I would expect them to be familiar. They don't have to be word perfect. It's not bedtime reading or anything like that, but certainly recommend governors actually join our training next month with governors for schools, of course, as far as the new edition is concerned. But then ensure it's talked about, and ensure as governors, when it is talked about in your board, you understand the changes, you understand what the requirements on schools are. A great way to do it, you may have missed the opportunity now, but perhaps for the future, when your school's designated safeguarding lead is actually updating the staff, ask if as governors, if the governors are actually welcomed in school at that stage, COVID permitting, of course, ask if you can attend that training too. So it's not about being wedded to the publication, but it is about understanding the role that that publication plays in schools. And therefore, I would say it's a really good idea. Yes, do it, but no one's going to lock you up if you don't.
And I think from a knowledge point of view, if you understand some of the principles and the expectations, and that is really only gained from having oversight of the whole document, you are more knowledgeable as a consequence, and therefore better able to ask those questions under that safeguarding bit of your agenda that come from an informed point of view. So nobody's going to test you on your knowledge and understanding, but they are going to hold the board to account for ensuring that the school has adequate measures in place, and one feeds into the other.
Okay, let's move on at that stage, folks. Ofsted is the next one that we're going to actually talk about. Ofsted are back in business, as Linda intimated a little earlier. Three things really to actually think about. There are some updates in terms of the time of inspection, which we're going to share with you. There's some, sorry, new, that should be new. Sorry, that's a typo on my part. I do apologize. Some new guidance documents that have actually been published. A couple have been updated as well. And then a couple of brief words about the impact that COVID will have this term in terms of how it influences inspection itself. First one of those is on timings, and Ofsted have announced that because obviously they have now gone virtually 19 months without any inspection at all, that's given them something of a significant backlog. And what Ofsted has said is that schools who were last inspected before the pandemic actually hit, so in other words, before March 2020, they can now expect a delay of up to 6 terms in terms of when their school will now be next inspected. Now, that's not, I think, an excuse for any of us to perhaps heave a sigh of relief and rest on our laurels, because Ofsted can, of course, go into any school at any time. This is just really an alert to say that the timetable has been pushed back because of the pandemic. New schools still have a bit of a breathing space. New schools includes academies, either schools freshly converting to academy status or those switching from one multi-academy trust to another. Their first inspection now is not expected to take place until 3 years after the opening. So again, there's a period of grace there. And just a reminder at the bottom, this sort of sneaked in during the various lockdowns, the legislation granting exempt status to schools previously judged to be outstanding has now ended. So exempt schools, not a category anymore. So those of you who are sitting in your schools on outstanding judgments, have a look at when your school was last inspected. Certainly in the authority in which I live, I think the longest standing judgment actually is 14.5, nearly 15 years now. Ofsted have said that those who have gone longest without inspection will rise to the top of the list. That's notwithstanding other factors, of course. So if you don't know that, that's something to think about and to ensure that you are up to speed in terms of the Ofsted framework itself. As far as the guidance and the updates to the guidance is concerned, we've just given you three documents here really just to flag up where some of these changes are. I think the reason I put the Inspecting Schools Guide for Maintained Schools and Academy on the left-hand side there as the first one, these aren't necessarily in date order, as you will see, but this is actually a summary of what schools should expect. So for me, it's actually quite a helpful document, certainly for us as governors, particularly perhaps if you're a new governor. This tells you a little bit about how inspection works, some of the things on timing, some of the protocols that Ofsted will be using. This was actually produced in 2019 to coincide with the launch of the current framework. And I think it's really helpful to remind ourselves as well, of course, that framework that we have at the moment is not a new framework. This is still the current framework launched back in September 2019, has the curriculum as its backbone, of course. It hasn't changed, it's just been nuanced by some of the post-COVID, or even post-COVID, some of the lessons perhaps that have been learned from COVID, and some of the lines of inquiry that Ofsted will want to cover as a consequence of that. There have been changes to the Ofsted inspection handbooks. They've all been updated, as you can see that box bottom left there, on the 1st of September. And helpfully, the document that I've referred to in the top right is a summary of changes in those handbooks. So if you want a quick shorthand read, that's a good one to go to.
Steve, George has asked a question about timings of inspection, and he's asking if we have any idea how and whether the backlog will affect Section 8 monitoring visits.
Section 8 monitoring visits are part of the the workload of Ofsted. Ofsted decide which are going to be Section 8 and which are going to be Section 5, Section 5 being the full inspection, of course. There are some Section 8 visits which of course are directed towards those schools which Ofsted would always prioritise in terms of their inspections, and those would be the schools that Ofsted would describe where there's the greatest need for improvement. So schools that have already been judged either to be inadequate, either serious weaknesses or special measures, their Section 8s will always take priority. They always have, even during the pandemic closures. Schools who are sitting on a requires improvement judgment, and perhaps that's the second requires improvement judgment, they will also find themselves jumping up the list as well, of course. But no, the normal plan of the normal play of inspections, I should probably say more appropriately, is that there is a mixture, but most inspections will tend to be Section 8 for shorter ones, because of course if you're a school that has a previously good judgment, you would in most circumstances get a Section 8 anyway. So Ofsted have published no details about the frequency or any difference there, so I think we have to assume that that will be business as usual. Okay, so as far as COVID is concerned and the impact it's had on inspection, this is all fairly common sense stuff, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But as I said in the introduction to this section, it's the same framework, it's just nuanced with some of Ofsted's observations and conclusions that they've drawn. Therefore, what inspectors will be focusing on, as Linda implied earlier, of course, is some schools have got gaps in pupil progress, gaps in pupil knowledge, which have come about because of time missed or perhaps not full engagement with that remote learning that was actually taking place. So this whole idea of recovery is about recovery in the rates of progress of children's learning. As far as Ofsted are concerned, that is going to be a line of inquiry. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever. We hinted at peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence in the section on keeping children safe. You will all be aware, hopefully, of the Everyone's Invited website. The moment that went viral, it was in all of the media as well as social media. That got the government to actually take notice. Ofsted did some research back in the early part of the summer term, which was published at the end of June. That is now a very significant priority, quite rightly, for all schools. And of course, Ofsted, because they've conducted the research, they have put it high on the agenda. Linda mentioned Amanda Spielman's various media appearances last week. She mentioned it in several of those, that this is actually one of the central themes of inspection this term. And I think the thing to bear in mind here, Ofsted have said, and even the Department for Education have said, even if your school is one that is not mentioned on the Everyone's Invited website, and many are, it doesn't mean to say the problem doesn't exist in your school. So the advice from Ofsted and from the department is, even if you've never had a report about sexual abuse and violence on a peer-on-peer basis, don't assume it is not there. Assume it is, just assume it's not being reported, and therefore think about what you can do to encourage a greater level of awareness, a greater level of reporting, and hopefully the ability to actually build on resilience of children and young people. That links, of course, perfectly into the relationship, sex and health education, and the new statutory requirements from September last year. All schools now, from the beginning of the summer term, are expected to be teaching that new curriculum. And of course, that new curriculum should absolutely include modules about peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence, tailored, of course, to the age and made age appropriate for whichever stage of education or phase of education your school is in. Don't forget, of course, as I said at the beginning of this section, the curriculum is still the backbone of this framework. That does not go away, and neither does safeguarding. Of course, that's often described that as the golden thread many years ago. They don't use that terminology anymore, but it most certainly is absolutely vital and runs through all inspections. Again, a couple of questions, more than a couple, there's 5 questions in fact on this slide. You might want to think about when your school or schools are expecting a visit from Ofsted. You might want to think about when it was due and what implications there may be as a consequence of that. Thinking about compliance, Ofsted are always keen to talk to governors about aspects of compliance, particularly on relationship, sex and health education. That's the most pertinent at the moment, of course. And has your governing board had a discussion about peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence? I keep mentioning this morning. I think this is the 4th or 5th time I've mentioned it. There's a good reason behind that. I think for me, good governance, effective governance in the autumn term of 2021 means that all boards ought to have a narrative that can be shared, a narrative that can be understood when Ofsted come to call. And therefore, I think it's absolutely crucial that's on our agenda right now. Ofsted are going to expect us as governors to clearly articulate what the COVID story is for our school, and most importantly, how we've responded to it. The so what question is never far away from Ofsted's narrative, and therefore it's vital as governors that we understand that. And of course, because of the curriculum, because of that being the backbone, a lot of schools perhaps have tended not to have the curriculum development as at the forefront of their thinking in the last 18, 19 months or so. As governors, we need to think about when was the last time that a review of the status of the curriculum was actually discussed at board level, because that's something that shouldn't be lost sight of either. I'm just aware that the clock is ticking by. Sorry, Linda, are there any more questions on that before I skip forward?
No, I've answered a couple of questions individually.
Thank you.
But there's nothing more on the safeguarding.
Perfect, thank you. Couple of quick last slides to actually finish with. I'm aware that we're getting close to 9 o'clock. If there are any questions, folks, please do keep those coming, and we will respond to you directly after the event. Schools Admissions Code. Sorry.
Can I just to say, because I think it was important that we don't run out of time without answering it. There was a couple of questions around the pupil premium, the recovery funding, which I managed to misinform people at the moment. So I wonder whether we might just take that before we just quickly finish the admissions one.
Yes.
And that was that clarification about who gets the 145 and who gets the 290. So just to clarify, all pupils that are eligible, all schools that receive pupil premium funding will receive this recovery funding. Mainstream schools will get £145 for each pupil. And the guidance is saying £290 for each eligible pupil in a special unit. That's where Steve was saying the confusion is. What clarity is there around what is a special unit? And it then says in the guidance that other types of eligible schools will get £290 for each eligible pupil. So I think that's where the confusion is. If you get pupil premium, you'll get the 145. The issue is about, is it every pupil who is either in a special unit or has an EHCP plan? What is the clarity about that 290? And we don't have the absolute answer to that, do we, Steve?
No, we don't, and we're waiting to see when the payments come through as to what the DfE's interpretation of that is. So apologies for the confusion, folks, but as I say, that's just the way the guidance is written at this point in time. Okay, so moving on to just sweep up the session with a brief word about the admissions code. The admissions code usually sits in situ for a prolonged period of time. The one that we have in place, or had in place, was first published in 2014. So 7 years that's been in place. It has now been usurped by this latest version, which came into place on the 1st of September. There are some important changes here, and key changes to actually be aware of are that children who are now classified as vulnerable pupils, that can include those with educational healthcare plans, as well as those who are vulnerable from a safeguarding perspective, they now have to be set as a priority group as far as in-year admissions are concerned. So this is a very real change. Many of you perhaps will already have seen consultation documents coming out from your local authorities. It is a requirement. This is a statutory code, and therefore anybody who is their own admissions authority, so that's all academies, as well as voluntary aided schools, I should say, within the maintained sector. There's also an important section in here because the guidance was changed in the summer of this year regarding what's called in-year fair access. So this is about pupils who, for whatever reason, are wanting to be admitted to schools, not at the normal time of September, but during the year. And in the past, some schools, slightly less honourable than others, have been telling the local authority they were full, therefore they couldn't accept further pupils. It is now a statutory responsibility on schools, if they have places, to actually be honest about them, irrespective of what the needs of those pupils might actually be. So just a couple of questions there. Are you aware of the new code? Even if you are a maintained school and you're not your own admissions authority, you still need to be aware of those changes, of course, because they do have an impact in terms of admissions into your school. And that does mean that there is a need to review the policy, of course. So that, again, if you don't see that coming up on your agenda this term, it's a good question to ask. And last but by no means least, just wanted to quickly say something about the early years framework. Early years foundation stage framework, again, is a statutory document. It applies to reception and nursery education, and published in March this year, so it's not new in terms of a new publication, but it's new in terms of the implementation date, because as you can see from the screen print on the left-hand side of the slide there, came into effect on the 1st of September. Most of your schools, if you have an early years foundation stage, will be well aware of this. My question really is, are governors as aware as perhaps they should be? The aim of the changes really is to improve learning outcomes at the end of the early years foundation stage. In other words, when children reach age 5, they're about to transition into key stage 1 and onto the national curriculum. What the government wants to do is improve those learning outcomes there, and therefore the significant change that we need to be aware of as governors is there is greater emphasis now on early language and early literacy within the curriculum of early years foundation stage. There have also been a lot of changes with regard to reporting and assessment in early years, and those the government is claiming are aligned to its policy of reducing teacher workload. So just to be aware of that, really. But no questions as such for governors, but just a little thought to actually take away on this last slide. As governors, if you have an early years foundation stage in your school, do you as a board know enough about it? Is there perhaps an opportunity now to perhaps have a brief input into a governing board meeting from the early years lead in your school, so that governors understand not just the curriculum in early years, but also know a little bit more about the outcomes and what they're aiming to be under this new system? Okay, well, that brings us to the end of what we wanted to share with you this morning, folks. I think I've run a minute over, so I do apologise for that. If there are any last questions, Linda, that we haven't answered?
No, there's nothing there that we haven't picked up either in a message back or generally. Perfect.
Well, we will review all of the questions. If we do think we've missed any after the event, we'll get back to you individually. But as ever, we've given you a list of the various publications and guidance documents that we've referred to during this morning's webinar. All of those links are working. We tested them again this morning, so please feel free to use those if you will. And just to say thank you very much indeed for joining us for this hot topic session this morning. Sorry, I nearly dropped my laptop then. Thank you very much for joining the session this morning. We hope you found it useful. I hope you join some of the other sessions that are planned for the Governors for Schools conference this week. It looks to be an exciting programme, and we look forward to seeing you all in the not too distant future. Thank you very much indeed.